I remember sitting in a room full of people laughing at something that it didn't land for me, you know? Everyone seemed comfortable, the conversation was easy, the energy was light, and I had this strange feeling, not that anything was wrong, just that I didn't fully belong in that moment. Like I was slightly out of phase with the room. And I felt that more times than I can count. Not dramatically, just quietly. Like everyone else got the rhythm of life, and I'm listening to a slightly different beat. If that feeling sounds familiar, stay with me. Feeling different isn't always loneliness. When people hear feeling different, they assume it means isolation. But that's not always true. You can have friends, you can be social, you can have a full life and still feel like you're observing the world from a slightly different angle. Not better, not worse, just different. And that difference can feel confusing because there's nothing obvious to fix. You just notice things others don't seem to notice. I once had a conversation where everyone was talking about something completely normal. Weekend plans, trips, work updates. And while the conversation moved easily, my mind kept drifting somewhere else. I kept thinking about how strange it is that we all build these lives around routines we rarely question. Not in a cynical way, just in a Curious George kind of way. And I remember thinking, is everyone else thinking about this too, or is it just me? That moment wasn't sad face emoji, but it was revealing. Awareness can make you feel out of sync. Sometimes feeling different simply means you're paying attention. Attention to patterns, motivations, contradictions, unspoken emotions. When you start noticing things, it can create distance. Not because you're separating yourself, but because you're seeing layers other people might not be focused on in that particular moment. And awareness changes how you experience ordinary situations. People move at different speeds internally. Externally, life moves fast. Schedules, work, deadlines. But internally, people move at different speeds. Some people process things quickly and move on. Others sit with questions longer. They reflect. They observe. They take longer to decide what something means. That slower internal pace can make you feel slightly out of step with environments built for speed. But slower doesn't mean lost. Sometimes it means deeper. There was a moment years ago where I remember thinking, why do I think about things this much? Not in a proud way, more like in a mild frustration. Most people seemed able to take things at face value. I couldn't. Every situation felt like it had layers, you know? And I wondered if that meant something was wrong with me. It took a long time to realize it wasn't wrong. It was just the way my mind worked. What if the feeling of being slightly different isn't a problem? What if it's information? When you feel out of place in certain environments, it It might not be because you're not meant to operate exactly the way the environment does, not superior, just differently wired. Some people thrive in fast movement. Some thrive in reflection. Some thrive in creation. Some thrive in stability. Your internal rhythm might simply be pointing toward where you actually fit. Trying to normalize yourself drains energy. When you feel different, it's easy to start adjusting yourself constantly. You try to talk differently, react differently, hide certain thoughts, avoid certain questions. You attempt to smooth the edges. But maintaining a version of yourself that isn't natural, now that takes effort, my friends. And over time, that effort becomes fatigue. Not dramatic fatigue, just a quiet sense that you're always slightly performing. Many thoughtful people feel this way. Here's something interesting. When you talk privately with thoughtful people, a lot of them admit something similar. They've also had moments where they felt slightly out of sync with the room. Not because they disliked people, but because their mind wandered towards deeper questions. And when you realize other people experience that too, something shifts. You stop assuming you're the anomaly. Once I mentioned this feeling casually to someone I respected, just in passing, and they immediately said, "Oh yeah, I always feel like that." No hesitation, no explanation needed. It was strange how revealing that was. And not because it solved anything, but because it confirmed that feeling different isn't as rare as we assume. It's just rarely spoken about openly. You may not be different. You may just be honest with yourself. Some people feel this way, but never acknowledge it. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They avoid the questions, big or small. But if you're someone who notices these things, it may simply mean you're more willing to sit down with your thoughts. And that honestly can feel isolating sometimes, but it also leads to clarity. Over time, you stop trying to match everyone else's rhythm. You start learning your own. The strange thing about feeling different is that it often softens over time. And not because you become the same as everyone else, but because you realize the world is full of amazing people who quietly feel the same way. Kindred spirits, your tribe. They just don't say it out loud. So if you ever feel you're slightly out of sync with the room, maybe that doesn't mean you're misplaced. Maybe it just means you're paying attention, my friends. And attention, when you follow it honestly, eventually leads you somewhere that fits. I'm Scott Stewart, and you're not crazy.